There is a quiet embarrassment hidden in many old towns. Iron gates that have stood in the rain for 500 years. Hinges that still turn without complaint. Chains pulled from riverbeds, darkened, scarred, dulled by centuries underwater, and yet never broken. And standing right beside them is newer steel, flaking, cracked, already replaced. The uncomfortable truth is right there, in plain sight. Some iron shaped by medieval hands has lived longer than metal produced by modern machines. That should not be possible, at least not according to the story we keep telling ourselves. We believe progress always moves forward, that newer materials must be stronger, that refinement automatically means improvement, that what comes later is always better than what came before. History refuses to cooperate. Across churchyards in Europe, wrought iron fences still stand while 20th century steel railings have vanished. In long-abandoned castles, iron straps continue to hold doors together, even as the wood around them has rotted into dust. Farming tools pulled from the soil look tired, worn down, but whole. Medieval people would not have called this a miracle. They likely would not have understood the question at all. To them, iron was not a product, it was a companion. They watched how it behaved in fire, how it softened, how it resisted, how it yielded beneath the hammer. They learned its temperament through repetition, not theory, through years of attention, not explanation. A bar of iron was never rushed. It was folded, worked, allowed to rest, then worked again. Mistakes revealed themselves early. Weakness announced itself without disguise. What endured was kept. What failed was remembered. Modern steel is born in enormous quantities, far from human hands and watchful eyes. It arrives already shaped, already confident. It promises uniform strength. But that uniformity comes at a cost. Medieval iron was never perfect, and that imperfection mattered. Within its dark grain were traces of countless hammer blows. Slag left behind, never fully driven out. Old blacksmiths believed those lines gave iron patience. They did not speak of atoms or structures. They spoke of toughness, of metal that bends before it breaks, of iron that forgives pressure. They trusted what survived winter, war, and neglect. So the question is not why wrought iron lasted so long. The question is why we stopped making metal in a way that allowed time to test it slowly. To understand why wrought iron endured, you have to step into a world where replacement was not an option. Medieval people did not throw things away because they failed. They lived with the consequences of failure. And that reality shaped how iron was made, used, and trusted. A broken object was not an inconvenience. It was a disruption. A snapped hinge could leave a home exposed. A fractured chain could lose livestock. A failed tool could cost an entire season of work. In that world, the most dangerous material was not the weakest one. It was the one that failed without warning. Wrought iron earned its place because it almost never did that. When stressed, it complained. It bent, it stretched, it showed fatigue in visible ways. Long before it broke, it asked for attention. Medieval blacksmiths noticed this pattern again and again. And over time, they began to choose iron not for how impressive it looked when new, but for how honestly it aged. This honesty mattered. Wrought iron was worked by hand, heated and hammered repeatedly, often over many sessions. Each cycle changed it slightly. Each blow aligned it more, made it more predictable. Slag remained trapped inside, drawn out into long, dark threads. No one knew what those threads were, but everyone could see what they did. Cracks slowed. Stress spread instead of concentrating. Damage revealed itself gradually. The iron did not hide its weakness. That made it safe. In contrast, steel, especially harder steel, could appear perfect right up until the moment it failed. Medieval smiths learned to be cautious with it. Steel was reserved for edges, for places where hardness mattered more than forgiveness. Wrought iron was chosen for everything that had to endure weight, weather, and misuse. This division was not based on theory, it was based on watching things survive. A wrought iron gate might sag over decades, but it stayed standing. A railing might warp, but it did not shatter. A chain might stretch, but it did not suddenly snap and throw its load into chaos. That gradual decline was not a flaw. It was a feature. Time, after all, was the only resource medieval people truly trusted. Iron objects were expected to live long lives. They were repaired, reforged, reshaped. A bar that bent was heated and straightened. A hinge that wore thin was thickened again. Iron carried its history openly, scars and all, and those scars made it stronger in the ways that mattered most. Modern materials often aim to eliminate variation. Uniformity is praised, consistency is rewarded. But wrought iron was never uniform. It varied from piece to piece, even within the same object. Medieval blacksmiths did not fight this, they worked with it. They understood something quietly profound. The world does not apply stress evenly, so a material that responds unevenly can survive longer. Rain falls harder on one side of a structure. Loads shift. Foundations settle. People misuse tools. Wrought iron absorbed these irregularities without demanding ideal conditions. It bent where it needed to bend. It yielded where it had to yield. And by doing so, it protected the whole. There is also the matter of scale. Medieval iron was made close to where it was used. The same blacksmith who forged a gate might later be called to repair it. He knew how it was made. He remembered its behavior. This continuity created feedback. Methods that produced iron that aged well were repeated. Methods that led to sudden failure quietly disappeared. Nothing was optimized for speed. Everything was optimized for survival. Modern steel often enters the world anonymously. Designed in one place, produced in another. Used far away by people who will never meet its maker. Feedback is delayed. Responsibility is distributed. Failure becomes a statistic rather than a memory. Medieval wrought iron never had that luxury. It lived among the people who depended on it. When it failed in front of them. And so blacksmiths learned to fear brittle strength more than modest weakness. They learned that durability was not about resisting all change, but about enduring it. This is why so much wrought iron still exists. Not because it was indestructible, but because it was honest. It aged visibly. It warned before it failed. It invited repair rather than demanding replacement. And perhaps that is the most unsettling realization of all. Wrought iron did not last because medieval people were more advanced. It lasted because they assumed the world would be harsh, unpredictable, and unforgiving, and they made their materials accordingly. The iron survived because it was made for reality, not perfection. And once you see that, it becomes hard not to wonder what else we have made too perfect to last. There is a reason wrought iron survived not just generations but centuries, and it has less to do with chemistry than with expectation. Medieval people did not believe objects were ever finished. Nothing made of iron was assumed to be complete, stable, or final. The day a gate was hung was not the end of its life. It was the beginning of a long relationship with weather, weight, misuse, and time. Iron was expected to change, and because that change was anticipated, it was planned for from the very beginning. A medieval blacksmith did not imagine his work frozen in perfection. He imagined it bending slightly in winter cold. He imagined it straining under uneven loads. He imagined it rusting, slowly, visibly, honestly. And because he imagined those futures, he forged iron that could survive them. Wrought iron was made to age in public. Its wear was not hidden. Its fatigue did not stay silent. When it weakened, it showed itself early, long before disaster arrived. That visibility mattered more than strength ever could. Modern materials often fail quietly. Stress builds invisibly. Corrosion hides beneath coatings. Damage accumulates until the moment it can no longer be contained. Medieval iron behaved differently. It announced its limits. It sagged, it warped, it complained. And in doing so, it gave people time. Time to notice, time to repair, time to intervene before collapse. Repair was not an admission of failure, it was expected. Wrought iron welcomed the fire again and again. A bent bar could be reheated and straightened. A worn hinge could be thickened. A stretched chain could be reforged. Each repair did not weaken the iron's identity, it strengthened its story. A repaired object was not suspect. It was trusted because it had already survived stress and returned. This created a world where materials and people aged together. Iron carried scars, and those scars were respected. They were evidence of endurance, not imperfection. Medieval communities understood this instinctively. They did not discard objects at the first sign of wear. They listened to them. They learned their patterns. They noticed when change accelerated and acted accordingly. There is a discipline hidden in that way of living. It requires attention. It requires humility. It requires accepting that nothing remains ideal for long. Medieval blacksmiths did not try to defeat time. They worked with it. They assumed time would test everything they made, and they designed iron that could survive being tested slowly. This philosophy extended beyond the forge. Structures were rarely built at the edge of their capacity. Loads were conservative. Iron was used generously. What modern eyes might call inefficiency was, in truth, caution shaped by experience. Without calculations or formulas, builders added material until things felt safe, until memory said it would hold. This gave wrought iron room to age, room to weaken slightly, room to forgive mistakes. Modern design often removes that room. Efficiency trims away excess. Optimization narrows margins. When everything works perfectly, the system holds. When conditions shift, failure accelerates. Medieval iron survived because it was never forced to live at the edge of its limits. There is also the matter of proximity. The people who forged wrought iron lived among the people who depended on it. When something failed, it failed close to home. The consequences were immediate and personal. This created a feedback loop that no modern supply chain can replicate. Techniques that produced iron that aged well were repeated. Methods that led to sudden failure disappeared quietly, along with the reputations of those who used them. Knowledge did not spread because it was clever. It spread because it survived. Over time, this filtered out ideas that were impressive but dangerous. Brittleness was feared more than softness. Sudden failure was more alarming than gradual decline. Iron that bent was preferable to iron that snapped. This preference shaped generations of craft, not through theory, but through lived consequence. Wrought iron fit that worldview perfectly. It did not resist change, it accommodated it. It bent instead of breaking. It rusted slowly instead of collapsing without warning. It invited maintenance instead of demanding replacement. It asked for patience rather than precision. And patience was something medieval life understood deeply. When we look at ancient ironwork still standing today, we are not just seeing metal. We are seeing a way of thinking made solid, a mindset that assumed the world would be harsh, unpredictable, and indifferent to human plans. A mindset that did not trust perfection, but respected endurance. This is what modern eyes often miss. Wrought iron did not last because it was stronger in some absolute sense. It lasted because it was honest. Honest about its limits. Honest about its fatigue. Honest about the fact that time always wins in the end. The iron endured because it never pretended otherwise. And once you recognize that, the question changes. It is no longer why wrought iron survived so long. The real question is why we so often design things today as if time will not touch them, as if wear is an anomaly rather than a certainty. Medieval blacksmiths assumed reality would be unforgiving, so they made iron that could forgive back. That is why it lasted. Not because it resisted the world, but because it was built to live inside it. There is another reason wrought iron endured, one that is uncomfortable because it has nothing to do with skill, tools, or even materials. It has to do with restraint. Medieval blacksmiths did not try to extract everything iron could possibly give. They stopped early on purpose, and that choice may be the quiet foundation beneath centuries of survival. In the medieval world, pushing a material to its absolute limit was considered reckless, not admirable, not ambitious, dangerous. Iron was not something to be conquered, it was something to be negotiated with. Every time it was heated, hammered, bent, or cooled, the blacksmith watched for signs that it was nearing refusal. And when those signs appeared, he did not push harder. He backed away. This instinct ran deep. A bar of wrought iron that could carry more weight than it was ever asked to carry was considered good iron. Not wasteful, not inefficient, safe. Medieval people did not design for optimal performance. They designed for margin. Margin against weather. Margin against misuse. Margin against the unknown. Because the unknown was always present. Loads were rarely predictable. Carts were overloaded. Gates were slammed. Animals pulled harder than expected. Winter cold changed how metal behaved. Summer heat did the same. In that environment, a material that worked perfectly only under ideal conditions was a liability. Wrought iron was trusted because it did not demand perfection from the world. It accepted uneven stress, it tolerated abuse, it allowed for ignorance. And it did all of this because it was never driven to the edge of what it could theoretically endure. Medieval blacksmiths left strength unused on purpose. They treated excess capacity as protection, not waste. Modern thinking often reverses this logic. Efficiency is praised. Excess is trimmed away. Materials are asked to perform exactly as designed, no more and no less. When everything behaves as predicted, this works beautifully. When reality intrudes, failure arrives quickly. Medieval iron lived in a world where reality intruded constantly. So restraint became wisdom. Blacksmiths learned that iron remembered. Not in a scientific sense, but in a practical one. Iron that was pushed too hard once was more likely to fail later. Iron that had been overheated too often became unpredictable. Iron that had been stressed near its limits carried that stress forward, invisibly. So, smiths learned to leave room. They learned to stop before exhaustion. This is one reason wrought iron often appears overbuilt to modern eyes. Thick bars, heavy straps, redundant fastenings. What looks excessive now was intentional then. Those extra margins allowed iron to age, to corrode slowly, to lose a little strength without losing its purpose. They also allowed iron to be reused. Wrought iron was rarely discarded after a single life. Bars were cut down and reforged. Old chains became new ones. Hinges were reshaped. The material circulated through generations, accumulating history. And because it had never been pushed too close to its limits, it could survive these rebirths. Modern steel, optimized for a single purpose, often cannot. This difference reflects a deeper contrast in values. Medieval craft assumed continuity. Objects were expected to outlive their makers. Responsibility extended forward in time. A blacksmith knew his work might still be used by people he would never meet. That knowledge encouraged caution. It discouraged brilliance at the expense of reliability. There is also a moral dimension here that modern discussions rarely acknowledge. In medieval communities, failure was visible. If iron broke, everyone saw it. Trust was lost. Reputation suffered. There were no disclaimers, no distant manufacturers, no warranties written in small print. The maker stood close to the outcome. This proximity reinforced restraint. It taught blacksmiths that it was better to deliver something slightly heavier, slightly softer, slightly less impressive if it meant it would endure. Pride was placed not in pushing boundaries but in avoiding catastrophe. The greatest compliment was not admiration, but silence. Nothing breaking, nothing failing, nothing needing attention. Wrought iron rewarded this mindset. It did not surprise its makers. It behaved consistently when treated conservatively. Over time, this reinforced the habits that kept it alive. Knowledge that encouraged restraint survived. Knowledge that encouraged risk disappeared. Again, this was not philosophy. It was selection by consequence. When we see ancient ironwork still standing today, we are seeing the result of countless small decisions to stop early, to leave strength unused, to accept limits, to distrust extremes. Those decisions accumulated into longevity. This is difficult for modern culture to accept because it runs against our instincts. We celebrate pushing limits, breaking barriers, extracting maximum performance. Medieval blacksmiths understood something quieter and more enduring. Limits are not enemies, they are warnings. And listening to them is often the difference between survival and collapse. Wrought iron lasted because it was never forced to prove how strong it could be. It was allowed to remain strong enough. That distinction may seem small, but stretched across centuries it becomes enormous. The iron endured not because it resisted restraint, but because it was shaped by it. There is one final advantage wrought iron carried, and it is rarely mentioned because it cannot be measured. It lived inside a culture that understood time differently. Medieval people did not expect the future to improve everything. They expected it to test everything. And that expectation shaped not only how iron was made, but how it was respected. An iron object was not anonymous. It had an origin. Someone knew who forged it. Someone knew whose hands had shaped it. Often, the same blacksmith who made an object would be called back years later to repair it. Sometimes decades later. Sometimes by the children of the person who first ordered it. This continuity created accountability that modern production has almost entirely lost. When iron failed, it failed in memory. A broken hinge was remembered. A bent bar was discussed. A chain that stretched too far became a story. These stories mattered. They traveled farther than instructions ever could. They shaped judgment. They shaped caution. They shaped what was trusted and what was avoided. Wrought iron benefited from this memory. Blacksmiths did not work in isolation from consequences. They lived with them. Their reputation was tied directly to how their iron aged, not how it looked when new. A piece that failed quietly years later could damage trust just as much as one that failed immediately. So, blacksmiths learned to think forward, far forward, beyond the moment of delivery. This long view discouraged shortcuts. Iron was allowed to cool slowly. It was allowed to rest. It was allowed to be worked again if something felt wrong. Nothing pressured the smith to deliver quickly at the expense of durability. Time spent now prevented embarrassment later. That logic was simple. and it was enforced by social reality. Modern materials often escape this loop. Designed by one group, manufactured by another, used by strangers far away. Failure becomes abstract. Responsibility becomes diffuse. Feedback weakens. Under those conditions, durability becomes optional rather than essential. Medieval wrought iron never had that luxury. It also lived in a culture that valued repair as skill, not failure. A blacksmith was admired not only for what he could make, but for what he could save. Repair required understanding. It required humility. It required listening to what the iron had become over time, not what it once was. This created a feedback cycle that strengthened both craft and material. Iron that could not be repaired easily was disfavored. Techniques that made repair difficult quietly disappeared. What survived were methods that allowed iron to return to the fire again and again without losing its integrity. Over generations, this favored wrought iron. It was not just durable, it was forgiving to human hands across time. It accepted correction. It allowed mistakes to be undone. It did not demand a single perfect moment. It allowed many imperfect ones. There is also the matter of respect. Medieval people did not assume mastery over materials. They assumed partnership. Fire was dangerous. Iron was unpredictable. Mistakes were costly. This encouraged a posture of care rather than domination. That posture shaped how objects were treated after they left the forge. Iron was not abused casually, it was not discarded casually, it was maintained, adjusted, and reused because it was known to respond to care. This mutual relationship extended the life of iron beyond what material properties alone could explain. Modern materials are often designed for indifference. They are expected to perform without attention until they fail. Wrought iron was designed for relationship. It performed best when noticed, respected, and maintained. This difference matters. Because time does not only test materials, it tests habits, it tests expectations. It tests whether a culture notices early signs of failure or ignores them until collapse becomes unavoidable. Wrought iron thrived in a culture that noticed. When iron creaked, someone listened. When it bent, someone responded. When it rusted, someone scraped and reforged. None of this was exceptional. It was normal. And normality sustained iron in ways no coating or treatment ever could. So when we see ancient iron still standing today, we are not just seeing good material. We are seeing a complete system that supported it. A system built on memory, responsibility, restraint, and care. Remove any one of those, and the iron's lifespan shortens dramatically. This is why comparisons between wrought iron and modern steel often miss the point. It is not just about metallurgy, it is about mindset, about whether durability is treated as an inconvenience or a responsibility. Wrought iron lasted because it belonged to a world that expected time to challenge everything and prepared accordingly. The iron survived because the people around it did not look away when it changed. And that may be the hardest lesson of all. Because making materials that last is never just a technical problem. It is a cultural one. When we look at wrought iron still standing today, it is tempting to treat it as an exception, a curiosity, a survivor that somehow escaped the rules that govern everything else. But that instinct is part of the misunderstanding. Wrought iron did not last because it was lucky. It lasted because it was made inside a way of thinking that no longer guides us. Medieval blacksmiths did not believe the future would be kinder than the present. They believed it would be harsher, wetter, colder, less forgiving. And so they did not ask their iron to be impressive. They asked it to endure. That single assumption changed everything. They assumed people would misuse tools, that loads would be uneven, that maintenance would be imperfect, that time would wear everything down. So they shaped iron that could absorb these realities without collapsing under them. Not forever, but long enough to matter. Modern culture often assumes the opposite. That precision will protect us, that optimization will save us, that systems will behave as designed. When they do, we are rewarded with efficiency. When they do not, we are shocked by how quickly things fail. Wrought iron reminds us that failure is not the surprise. Sudden failure is. The medieval world feared brittleness more than weakness. It feared silence more than wear. It valued materials that spoke before they broke, that bent before they snapped, that invited repair instead of demanding replacement. This was not wisdom written down, it was wisdom lived into objects. And those objects still speak if we are willing to listen. They tell us that durability is not just a property of materials, but of expectations. That longevity emerges when we plan for error instead of pretending it will not happen. That things last longer when they are allowed to change, and when someone is paying attention while they do. Wrought iron did not defeat time, it cooperated with it. Perhaps that is the lesson we struggle to accept, because cooperating with time requires patience, restraint, humility. It requires admitting that nothing we make is final, and nothing we design is immune to the world it must live in. The iron endured because it was made by people who knew that. And if we want our own creations to endure, we may need to recover not an old material, but an old way of thinking.